So the topic tonight is Ibn Sina. And the reason why I wanted to start with Ibn Sina is he wrote his opus magnum, the Canon of Medicine, in 1025. So this is the 1000th anniversary year for that book. And I just felt like we have to start there. To do this, though, some of you have seen my lectures before. I have to give you background, right? I just can't just throw you in and then you figure it out. So let's start with the background. The time period that Ibn Sina lives in is a turbulent time period. There's enormous political upheaval because the Middle East is actually reshaping itself. But to understand that, let me put the clock back a little bit. So in 632, the Prophet Muhammad dies. And when he dies, he's replaced by Khalifa Abu Bakr. He becomes the first leader of what will become the Arab Empire. In 632, his biggest problem is he has to put down the apostates that have popped up, and that becomes the Ridda Wars. It takes about a year. So by 633, he's done it. The amazing thing about that is it means that in 633, for the first time in history, there is a single state that ruled the entire Arabian Peninsula. That had never happened before. The Arabian Peninsula, parts of it had been conquered, but it had never been conquered as a single entity by anybody, right? The Romans owned the northwest corner, the Persians owned the northeast corner, and, by the way, the southeast corner. At one point, they even grabbed Yemen, so they even had the southwest corner, but nobody had ever conquered the whole thing. So a single state that ruled it. The shocking and incredible thing that happens next is Abu Bakr sends a letter to his general, Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was in Yamama at the time, and said, don't stop. And don't stop, well, there's only one thing past where he was, and that was the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was in its fourth iteration, but was 1,200 years old. So you can imagine that if you're a person living in that world, in that moment, you couldn't conceive of a world without the Persian Empire. I mean, 1,200 years, like it's not, how would you be able to imagine a world without it? The Roman Empire, with the name empire, had been around for 600 years, but Rome had already been imperial as a republic for about 300 years. So Rome, an imperial Rome, not necessarily the name, was 9 centuries. So that was also probably hard to imagine the world not having. To make the long story short, Khalid ibn al-Walid and then subsequent Arab armies will conquer an empire that stretched from Pakistan on one side to Spain on the other side. By 711, they had Spain, and they actually invaded Central Asia. The Greeks called it Bactria, so if I say Bactria, that's what I mean. And that meant they had the largest empire that had ever existed to that date. There have been subsequent empires that were bigger, but nothing had ever been that large before, because you got to remember they had conquered the entire Persian Empire plus a little bit extra on the east side, and then they conquered about 70% of the Roman Empire, the southern 70%. So Rome survived this, but not in especially great shape. In the process, they ended up with 3 things that are kind of important for our story's purpose. Obviously, ended up with a lot more than that, but 3 things for our story. One was this pull to go towards Rome, to be a Roman-style empire, to use Rome as its model. The other was to use Persia as its model. And there was a split, and in a way, the first fitna kind of represents that split, right? Muawiyah from Damascus, Ali ibn Abi Talib from Kufa. Kufa is in Iraq, Damascus is Syria, Syria was Roman, Iraq was Persian. So even in that moment, early on in the history of the Arab Empire, there's this pull, which direction it's going to go. The Umayyads, Muawiyah wins, and Damascus becomes the capital, and the pull goes in that direction to the point where Muawiyah almost captured Constantinople. And then subsequently, another Umayyad leader almost captured it a second time. So within a very brief period of time, that Arab state almost finished off the Roman Empire. Twice. Twice. By the way, it was a Syrian refugee who saved the Romans the first time, and then they used that. He invented a flamethrower, which is really cool. They used the flamethrower to save them the second time. Just think about like the thought process. I really want to throw flame on that guy there. How do I get the flame from here? Right? I just feel like the creative power sometimes is underestimated. So I said there were three things. The third thing was this. In a city called Gondishapur, it was built by Shapur I, the Persian emperor. There was an academy. And that academy had books from all over the world in it. The Great Library was bigger. It had a lot more information in it, but it was destroyed in 391 or 392 by a mob. So Gondishapur became the largest still functioning academy on the planet at that time. So when the Arabs conquered the Persian Empire, they've now inherited this academy. And at first, they weren't really sure what to do with it. The Umayyads were not really tapping into it, but they left it alone. So there's a period of time where it's like on pause. But then comes the Abbasid revolution. So the Abbasids go into revolt against the Umayyads, and it's not looking great for the Umayyads. By that point, by 750, the Umayyads were having trouble with their leadership. They had a few good Khalifa, but not that many, and it was starting to break down. So the Abbasids talk the Umayyads into negotiating. The Umayyads show up, and the Abbasids murder them. All except for one. And in 750, they then decide to move the capital to Iraq, and eventually they're going to move it to the city of Baghdad, which that was the name of a Persian village. They renamed the Persian village Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace, and then they built what they thought was going to be an impenetrable city that nobody would ever be able to capture. It had 2 rows of walls in a circle. The first row was short, the second row was tall. That way, if the enemy breached the first wall, you could still be on the second wall and shoot down on them. And then they had dividing walls in between that were in between height, so that you could also use those. And the thinking was, nobody will... By the way, have you noticed the Titanic design was shockingly similar? It had these compartments inside so that if the side was breached, it would fill that compartment, but then it wouldn't continue. Oh, if only the Titanic guys knew history, they wouldn't have done this. So they build this city, and then after a while, they go, all that material in Gondishapur, let's bring it here. And they make the House of Wisdom, and that triggers the Islamic Golden Age. That's the point when there's a whole new set of philosophy being generated, and it's being generated in the Middle East. Again, because, right, when you think about it, the first round of philosophy was generated in the Middle East too. Because really, is Greece not the Middle East? I'm pretty sure Greece is the Middle East. But it's also worth pointing out, philosophy started in what is today Turkey. It was started by a guy named Thales. Thales was ethnically Phoenician. He was living in a Greek city. It was a colony. So he wrote in Greek, and he spoke Greek, but it's blurry, which is how everything is. Isn't that cool? Isn't it cool you can't really categorize it at that moment? And by the way, wasn't his student, but she was like a couple of generations later. There was a woman named Aspasia who moved from Miletos, the city where philosophy originated. Hecataeus, Anaximander, Anaximenes were philosophers from that city that followed in Thales' footsteps. Aspasia got on a ship because her sister married an Athenian. She moved to Athens and started a school and taught Socrates. And Socrates credits her as his teacher. And when you think about it, in a way, then, philosophy got transmitted to Socrates by Aspasia. By the way, she also ended up becoming Pericles' lover, and Pericles the Younger is her son. And so she's a real person, in case you were like, I bet this is a myth. It's not. We've tried to delete her. We've done our best. It's just the problem is how do you explain Pericles the Younger, right? It's tricky. If he didn't exist, it would have been a lot easier to delete her. So the House of Wisdom brings this in, and we see this explosion of new philosophers, new information coming around. But there were some problems. One of the problems that they kept running into was Aristotle. Aristotle, parts of it was easy to read, and they were having no trouble getting into it. But then there were books like the Metaphysics that were driving everybody crazy. They were like tearing their hair out. They couldn't understand what was in the Metaphysics. Okay, so having said all that, I want to set up the political situation a little bit. I told you there was this pull that you go towards Rome or towards Persia. In the end, the Abbasids make it so the pull is towards Persia. It doesn't take long, but the Persians begin to disassemble the Arab Empire from within. To be clear, the very act of switching from Umayyad to Abbasid triggers the first breakup. They missed one of the Umayyads. He escaped, and he went across North Africa, and he went to Spain, and in 756, 6 years after his family members were massacred and he had escaped Syria, he broke Spain out of the Arab Empire and ruled it on his own. And the Umayyads will rule Spain from 756 until 1031. So in a really weird way, the Abbasid Revolution triggers the beginning of the end for the Arab Empire. In 819, the area that I'm going to be talking about in a second, the Samanid area, breaks out of the Arab Empire. It's right in the middle of Central Asia. It's where Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan are. And it just keeps going. In 890, the Hamanids break northern Iraq and Syria out of the Arab Empire. In 931, Tabaristan basically goes into rebellion. That's the area just in the northern part of Iran, just south of the Caspian Sea. It's mountainous. There were Dalamite soldiers that were being used in armies as mercenaries. They were really good soldiers. And they basically start to look at, well, why are we letting other people rule us? We could just rule ourselves. And Ziyarids are the first to break away in 931. And then by 934, the Buyids break away. And little by little, the eastern part of the Arab Empire just breaks up. In 946, the Buyids capture Baghdad. And then if there was any doubt up until that point if the Arab Empire was going to recover or put itself back together, it was erased, right? Because at that point, one of the breakaway Persian states now has the capital of the Arab state. But the Abbasids are still the Khalifas. They're still officially in charge on paper, but they don't have any real political power. Every once in a while, an Abbasid would stand up and he would start to exert himself, and then the warlords in the area would fight him and put him back down. So that's it. The Arab Empire, 946 is the latest date you can give it for existing, but really by the 890s, it's pretty much finished. So it didn't have a long run necessarily, but it obviously has a massive impact. Depending on how you count first and second language speakers, Arabic is the third or fourth most widely spoken language on the planet today, right? It covers a huge chunk of the world. And so there's an impact there, but then there's also an impact on philosophy and technology and science that I want to get into a little bit using Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina was born right around 980. This is just a little flip of the numbers. 980 AD in the Samanid state in a village near Bukhara. Bukhara is in Uzbekistan. It's almost in the middle of Uzbekistan. He was Persian. So some of you are thinking, I thought Uzbekistan is Turkish. It totally is today. It wasn't then. So there's a really interesting feature about the Persians that I think is still kind of carries on, but it's been changed a little bit. So there really were two Persian societies. There was the civilized Persians that lived in what is today Iran, and then into Afghanistan and Western Pakistan, and also a little bit into Iraq and Turkey. And then there were the Saqa, the guys in the north. And they ruled an area that stretched from Romania to the very northwestern tip of Pakistan. So Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, that was their area, the Saqa. in English we say Scythians. They were the crazy Persians. They were the guys that they would dye their hair, starch it so it stood straight up. They would cover themselves in tattoos. They would take ephedra, like Sudafed, but the actual stuff. Sudafed is a stimulant because you feel sick. Ooh, take a stimulant. You won't feel sick. You'll still be sick, but anyway. Is that a good idea? Anyway, they would take the actual ephedra, they would boil it so that they could get to this stimulant, and then they would pour wine in it. And what they would do is they would pour it into a skull that they had taken from a person they had killed, and they would drink it, and then they would go into battle. That was those guys. And they were amazing. I would have loved to have seen it from a distance. Loved to have seen that from a distance. In any case, by the time my story gets to where it is, Turkish peoples have been moving into the area and have been actually crossing all the way into what is today Turkey for a few centuries. And there is a rival state, a Turkish rival state, the Karakhanids, who are just to the east of the Samanid state. So, in other words, in many ways, this is the end of Persian rule in that area, this story, because it corresponds with it. What happened was, before the Samanid state unravels, it became a center of learning. There was this explosion of philosophers and thinking that was taking place in Bukhara and just generally in the Samanid state. And so Ibn Sina, being born at that moment in this place, positioned him really well to get the kind of education he was going to need to become the person he will become. By age 10, his father was a minor bureaucrat, so his father didn't have any real special connection to anything. So this wasn't one of those stories where he leveraged connections. This was a story where people recognized his brilliance. At age 10, he had memorized the Quran. So you could flip the Quran open, tell him the page, say third paragraph down, and he could recite that paragraph from memory. I can't even comprehend what kind of information that is. That just blows my mind. I had a professor who could memorize texts, and we would do this with him. We would go, okay, John Stewart on Liberty, 7th page, 2nd paragraph, and we'd flip it open and look, and he would recite. It was bizarre, freaky. So by 10, he's already shown that there's something special about him because he can do this. His father went, okay, I need to nurture this. And he went and hired an Indian grocer because India had invented the numbers that we call, incorrectly, Arabic numerals. The reason we call them Arabic numerals is there was a Persian, see how complicated this is? India invents numbers, and then there's a Persian. His name was Khwarazmi. That Persian took those numbers and then advanced math. He's the guy who did algebra. He's the guy who wrote the world's first ever algorithm. But as a result, when Europeans first made contact with those numbers, they got it through his works, and not being able to differentiate between Persians and Arabs, they went, oh, Arab numerals. And so that's why. And by the way, in case you were wondering, because in the Middle East, there's one set of numbers, and then North Africa, Europe, why am I doing this? The entire rest of the world uses the other set of numbers. They were both from India. It's not that one was and one wasn't. I don't know why the Indians made 2 sets of numbers, but that's what they did. So, and then of course the really important thing was 0. But honestly, even if they hadn't done 0, it still would have been amazing having the digits, because do this as an exercise later. Make a number like 48, but write it the way the Romans did, and then multiply it by 3. You just don't want to live. There's no, what was that? What were the Romans even thinking? So what the Indians did revolutionized everything. So that's why you hire an Indian grocer to teach your kid math. So that's what he did. And of course, Ibn Sina absorbed math instantly, loved it. And then his father went, okay, I'm gonna get him into a jurisprudence school. And so at age 13, he's become a master of jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence. And so it becomes really clear this kid is going somewhere. So his father hires a guy named Al-Natali. to teach him philosophy. And al-Natali was living in Bukhara. He was a famous philosopher at the time. And they started going through books together. They did Isagoge by Porphyrius. They did Almagest by Ptolemaios, the Alexandrian scientist who tried to figure out how to make the Earth be the center of the universe. So if you've ever seen these really big, complicated models showing planetary motions from that time period, that they're all trying to prove the Earth is the center of the universe, which obviously I know we think it is still, but it's not. We should let go of that idea. And then he read Euclid's geometry. He read Aristotle. And at some point, al-Natali went to Ibn Sina and said, "You've passed me. You've eclipsed me. There's nothing more I can teach you. You're on your own." He's 16 at that point. So he has taken off. Al-Natali was a physician. And so Ibn Sina was just like, okay, I'll learn that too. So he teaches him what he knows. By 16, he had become so amazing that the physicians in the area would come to him for advice. At age 17, the emir of the Samanid state, his name was Nuh II, came to him and said, "I need you in the court. You're going to become my physician." And at age 17, he's in the royal court as a physician. By this point, in his autobiography, he wrote, anything that came my way, any book that came my way, I would just read it. I would absorb it. And what he says is he would find the hardest piece that philosopher was working on, the most complicated part of it. And he would open the book up to that piece, and then he would start to read it. And if he thought it was easy, he wouldn't bother. He'd walk away. He only wanted to read that philosopher if that piece was a challenge to him, and it stumped him. And he got stumped. The Metaphysics by Aristotle that I mentioned earlier. He gets stumped. He can't figure it out. And he says, I read it 40 times. Now, we don't know how many times he read it. He says, I read it 40 times because the thought was, if you read the Quran 40 times, you could memorize it. It became an idiom. I read something 40 times meant I've memorized the text. And he says in his autobiography, he says, I still had no idea what it said, but I knew there was some powerful wisdom in there. I just couldn't figure out how to extract it. It drove me nuts. This is the first time I'd ever been stopped like this. So one day he's in the marketplace, and he's in the book seller area. And the bookseller says, "This is the book you want." And Ibn Sina looks at it and says, "How much?" And the guy tells him the price, and Ibn Sina goes, "I don't need this book." And he refuses to buy it. So then the seller says, "Look, the guy selling it really needs money. I can lower the price. He told me what the bottom line price was. You need this book. Buy it from me." And so Ibn Sina buys the book. The book was written by Farabi. Farabi was a Persian philosopher from the previous century. Farabi was another polymath on a different scale, I think, than most of us can imagine. So Farabi had decided that he wanted to be able to criticize everything and anything. He wanted to be able to have commentary on politics and religion, which of course gets you killed. So he decided not to publish anything while he was alive. He refused to take any patronage money, so he refused to have a patron. He just would get simple jobs like a guard or a gardener. He would just get any kind of job to keep himself alive, and he'd move around and he'd study under philosophers and write and write and write and write. And then in his will, he published all his books. And then that way, he could say whatever he wanted and not get killed for it. So Al-Farabi really believed in Aristotle. He was an Aristotelian. He thought this was the key to understanding what needed to come next, right? That it would become the basis for all the philosophy that would follow. I'm not quite as sold on Aristotle, but I love what they end up doing. I'm more of a Platonist. just for the record, whenever you walk into a philosophy department, almost everybody is Aristotelian. I find these conversations really silly, in part because, dude, that was 2,300 years ago. There wasn't an update. Like, how are we still having this argument? Surely there's been there has. There's been a bunch of philosophy since. You don't have to be Aristotelian or Platonist anymore. We can move on now. Like, you can be a Heideggerian, for example. It'll get you in all sorts of trouble because people hate them. But it doesn't matter. You can still be that. You don't have... Anyway, so Farabi goes through, and he's working on Aristotle, and one of the things he's trying to do, and everybody had been trying to do it up until this point as well, was reconcile it with Islam. So Al-Kindi, many people refer to him as the first Arab philosopher. I'm not sure that's technically true, but he's maybe the first big-name Arab philosopher. That might be the clearer way to say it. He spent a lot of his time saying, look, wisdom can come from sources that are not Muslim, and it's just fine. God is much bigger than we are. There's no reason to think that there's only one source of wisdom. And so there was a lot of that going on. So by the time we get to Farabi, he's still working on this. This is still an issue for him. Having said that, there's at that point, there's 150 years of trying to reconcile the two. Ibn Sina isn't actually all that interested in doing this reconciliation because in Ibn Sina's mind, there is one science, one important science, and it's logic. So Ibn Sina was the first Vulcan. He was the first Spock from Star Trek, where he worshipped logic. He thought logic came before everything else. So biology is great, but you know what's better? Logic. And his reasoning was, it's funny that I use the word reasoning, his logic was, that makes more sense, that once you have an observation, you have to verify the observation with logic. It's not enough to simply accept that the observation is correct. In other words, logic is the necessary ingredient in everything. Today, I think our attitude is the different fields of science are somehow above logic. You use logic to get there, but it's the tool that gets you there. For Ibn Sina, it wasn't the tool that got you there, it was the end-all, be-all. And that the sciences served logic. So his interest in the metaphysics gets really interesting because of the way it was translated into Arabic. In Arabic, it was considered divinity, but Aristotle isn't talking about divinity in the metaphysics, right? He's talking about metaphysics. So there was a translation issue that I think was also messing people just in the title. The real problem with Aristotle's metaphysics, though, was it was written idiomatically. So if you say an idiom, the words in the idiom don't make literal sense. But people in the culture at that time period know what the idiom means because they know what it means because they were taught it. So I read Aristotle 40 times, you think, oh, he read it 40 times. That's not what it means. It means I memorized it, but because he's in that period, everybody around him knows what it means. Today, we might not know what it means. My favorite idiom is a stitch in time saves 9, because I keep trying to imagine a needle and thread going through a clock. A stitch in time saves 9. 9 what's? We don't know. Like $9, 9 lives, and it means, does anybody know? Perfect. He got it. Okay, so what he said was if you do a stitch now, so my button here, I put a stitch on it now, my button won't fall off, and then I'll have to do 9 stitches to sew it back on. So a stitch in time says maintenance is better than letting the thing break and replacing it. But you don't know that from the words because it doesn't make any sense. There's no literal thing. So what Al-Farabi did was he went through the metaphysics trying to figure out what all the idioms really meant. So he would take a shot, like he'd take a guess, and then he cracked it like a code. And then he made a book, and that's the book Ibn Sina bought. So in that moment, Ibn Sina could unfold Aristotle in his brain because he had the idioms from the metaphysics. By the way, there were idioms that they had run into in other texts as well. They just went, I just won't know what this sentence means. I'll skip it. I'll go to the next one. But now they know what those sentences mean too because Al-Farabi had figured it out. Al-Farabi was the kind of guy who liked to challenge the convention. And one of the things that he said, and it's one of the things that was sort of baked into Arab society was that God simply wouldn't abandon the non-Christians, non-Jews, and non-Muslims, and for that matter, the non-Zoroastrians. Because most people in the Muslim world at the time believed if you were Zoroastrian, Jewish, or Christian, you did have a pathway to salvation. You didn't have to necessarily be a Muslim to get to heaven. It was easier if you were, because you had the full instruction manual, but those other three religions had enough of the instruction manual that they could get to salvation. Al-Farabi went, well, what about the Hindus and the Buddhists and the animists and the polytheists? And then he said, there's no way an all-merciful, all-good God who only does the truth would have abandoned them. So there must be a path for them too, meaning that there are multiple ways you can gain wisdom from the world. And of course, this ends up influencing everybody afterwards, but it builds on the tolerance that had already been baked into the system. So Ibn Sina has figured out Aristotle. He's thrilled out of his mind. He's like this really, he must have been so annoying to be around. He's like 17, 18 years old, and he's working for the emir. Things are looking great, and then the emir dies. He died in 997. There's 2 years of political turmoil where they have 4 different emirs. By the way, 3 of them were the sons of Nur II. And then the Turks finish off the Samanid state. The Karakhanids conquer Bukhara in 999. And we don't know the exact year that Ibn Sina left Bukhara, but it was probably 999 because his connections to the state would have gotten him in trouble. He escaped to Gorganj. So Gorganj is in the Amu Darya river delta as it goes into the thing that used to exist called the Aral Sea that no longer exists, which is, to me, personally a heartbreak, but I guess who cares, right? It's just the only planet we can live on. We might as well destroy it and exploit it and ruin it. For our children and grandchildren, we'll be fine because we're just old enough. We'll probably make it to our life expectancy. Is that too cynical? Anyway, he goes to Gorganj, and in many ways, Gorganj, it was still Samanid ruled. So the Samanids had lost Bukhara, the state had basically collapsed, but the Turks hadn't yet captured it. It sort of replaced Bukhara for a brief period of time, and a lot of intellectuals moved there, and there was like another little burgeoning of philosophy, and he seemed to do okay for about 13 years. And then in 1012, the Karakhanids captured Gorganj. So he began traveling through Khorasan, heading west, until he got to Goran. Goran it still exists as a city. It's in Iran. It's just southeast of the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea has this nice little corner there. It's inland from there. And when he got there, he was hoping to have the ruler, a guy named Qaboos, be his patron. But shortly after getting there, it turned out Qaboos had died. So he decided to move, and he moved north to Dihistan. Dihistan is the land in between the Aral Sea and the Caspian Sea. He gets sick. He's not finding a future for himself there. So he abandons it, and he goes back to Goran. He stays there for maybe a year, and then he felt like he was getting in trouble politically. So he decides to leave again. And he moves to Ray. So Ray was controlled by the Buyids. I told you there were these 2 Persian groups from Tabaristan that created states, and they had been in a fight with the Ziarids who had Gorgan. So he's now kind of switching sides, right? He's moving from one rival to the other. He gets to Ray, and the ruler of Ray, Majd al-Dawla, this Buyid ruler, had depression, like really severe, bad depression. So Ibn Sina basically gets hired as the physician to treat this guy for his depression. Majd al-Dawla's mother, her name is Sayyida Serene. Serene, by the way, means sweet in Persian, so it's a good name to have. She is the de facto ruler of Ray. Her son is just laying on a sofa all day, staring at the ceiling, going, woe is me. And so she's actually running the state. So in addition to Ibn Sina serving as the court physician, he also takes the role as court treasurer and reports to her. He basically becomes a glorified accountant. So he goes to Hamadan. And the reason he goes to Hamadan is he wants to see if he can learn more from some other philosophers. And the tradition in Western Iran at the time was when a philosopher comes and visits a town, that philosopher has to debate one of the local philosophers. So it's like a sports match. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because then the audience will hear new ideas that are coming from this other place. But also it's a way to say, oh, look, our philosopher was better than your philosopher. So there's a little bit of like competition as well. It's not just for the sake of spreading ideas. And in the debate with this guy, I'm trying to remember his name. It'll come to me if I stop trying to think of his name. Anyway, in the debate with this guy, Abu al-Qasim, that's his name. In the debate with Abu al-Qasim, it got personal and it got really heated. And Ibn Sina threw at him the biggest insult he could conceive of. It's like 10-15, and he says, "You don't know logic." At that point, that guy loses it, and they're fighting back and forth. Long story short, Ibn Sina isn't satisfied after the debate and keeps going after the guy. So then the guy says, you know, I might not know logic, but I think you took the style of the Quran and then used it for your writings, which in my mind is immoral. You shouldn't be doing that. It's kind of like plagiarism, and it also makes you look like you're trying to pretend you have divine inspiration. And so now Ibn Sina feels like he's in really big trouble because he may have crossed some kind of boundary there. It's not true. It doesn't matter. The accusation has happened. To make things worse, Abu al-Qasim gets a job now working for Sayyid Serene, so he's now moved to Ray. So Ibn Sina goes, you know what, I'm going to move to Hamadan. So the philosophers switch towns. When he gets to Hamadan, he starts working for Shams al-Dawla, who's the brother of the depressed guy, Majd al-Dawla. But he's not depressed. Shams, his name is Sun. Of course, like sun is in the thing in the sky. Of course he's not going to be depressed. How could you be depressed if your name is big star in the sky? So he starts working for him. Things are okay in Hamadan. They're looking like he's going to be all right. And then disaster strikes. In 1023, Shams al-Dawla dies. When it happens, Ibn Sina is then asked to stay on as wazir. Oh, I forgot a little detail. Shams al-Dawla forced Ibn Sina to become his wazir. Ibn Sina was actually kind of tricked into it. Shams al-Dawla had been in battle. He got injured. He asks the court physician to come treat him, and then when he's there, he forced him into the wazirship that he didn't want. He wanted to do philosophy and research. He wanted to do medicine. He didn't want to advise the ruler on how to rule. So when Shams dies in 1023, his son says, stay on. Ibn Sina grabs his patron and says, look, we got to do something else. They go into hiding. And while they're in hiding, they get contacted. So there's this guy. His name is Muhammad ibn Rostam Dushmanzyar. So Rostam is an old Persian name. Like it goes to the Shahnameh. It's this deep. Think Gilgamesh style character. Big muscles, big man, likes to fight. That's Rostam. So this is this guy's name. And I am a firm believer that names have the ability to shape you. There's been studies. Some of the studies say no. Some of the studies say yes. So like, turns out people named Dennis tend to become dentists. And people named Lawrence tend to become lawyers. So there really is some evidence that this is a thing. Anyway, so I'm going to call him Dushmanzyar because I just really like that name. Dushmanzyar figures out where Ibn Sina is hiding. I don't know how. And he sends a note to him. And basically it's, how are you doing? I'm a big fan of your work. I'd love to make contact. right? It's that kind of stuff. And they start writing each other letters back and forth. The new wazir for Sama al-Dawla, the son of Shams al-Dawla, becomes suspicious that that's in fact what's happening, that Dushman Ziyar is making contact. We don't know exactly how they figured it out, but somebody ratted Ibn Sina out and said this is where he's hiding. And so the army comes, they break into his house, they search it, they arrest him, and they put him in prison in 1023. Word gets back to Dushman Ziyar that his idol's in prison. Now, just to clarify, Dushman Ziyar is Sayyida Shirin's nephew. In other words, Majd al-Dawla, the depressed guy, and Shams al-Dawla were Dushman Ziyar's first cousins, right? Because Shireen is their mom. So this is like a family affair at this point. So in other words, the Sama al-Dawla, the new ruler, is his first cousin once removed. So Dushman Ziyar takes his army, he marches to Hamadan, and he attacks. And he captures Hamadan, he overthrows his cousin, and he releases Ibn Sina from prison. Ibn Sina then goes to Esfahan. That's where Dushman Ziyar was the ruler. And at this point, the Buyids get into a little bit of trouble. There's a little bit of chaos going on. And Dushman Ziyar starts conquering chunks of Buyid territory. He was put in charge by the Buyids. Actually, his dad was rewarded a title, and then he just takes off. And now he's conquering land from his own state. And he basically creates a breakaway state. Usually it's referred to as the Kukuyid state or the Kukuyid dynasty. So while this is happening, the Ghaznavids, who are over in Afghanistan, get interested in what Dushman Ziyar is doing, and they're wondering if this isn't an opportunity for them to expand west. So in 1030, so Ibn Sina by this point has been in Isfahan for about 7 years, the Ghaznavids attack, and they defeat Dushman Ziyar, they capture Esfahan. Ibn Sina and Dushman Ziyar escape. They escape to Khuzestan. They wait there for a few months. The Ghaznavid ruler dies while in Esfahan, waiting for Dushman Ziyar to come surrender. And Dushman Ziyar grabs his army, goes back and takes Esfahan back and reestablishes his state. The problem was that while the Ghaznavids were in Esfahan, they plundered the library. So, I told you in 1025, Ibn Sina wrote the Canon of Medicine. Well, that was in Esfahan. He had been in Esfahan for 2 years. Under the patronage of Dushman Ziyar, Ibn Sina starts writing prolifically, and he's actually writing whole encyclopedias. He's writing treatises on philosophy. He does the Canon of Medicine. Well, those books get now taken to Ghazna, the capital for the Ghaznavids. And my stories usually end badly, so this will be no exception. There's a Ghurid ruler named Ala-ad-Din Hussein. The Ghurids were north of the Ghaznavids, north and east. So they had a big chunk of what is today Pakistan. And the Ghurid leader was really mad at the Ghaznavids because two of his brothers had gone and fought the Ghaznavids and were killed in 1150, so we're fast forwarding 120 years. Ala-ad-Din Hussein takes his Ghurid army to Ghazna, captures the city, and then there's an attempt to retake it by the Ghaznavids, but they fail to retake it. So to punish them, he sets the city on fire, and he brings fuel into the city, and he burns it for 7 days. He goes and burns another random city called Bust just to do it, just to bring it home. And they burnt the library, and the only copy of Ibn Sina's encyclopedia was in that library. So we have a lot of Ibn Sina's works, but that got rid of some of it. And he became known as Jahan Sus, which means world burner. So anyway, world burner is on my bad list. Don't like that guy. In any case, they recapture Esfahan. They've lost the library, right, because it got plundered. But Ibn Sina goes back to work, and he's producing more works again. And he and Dushmanziar become really good friends to the point where Ibn Sina actually travels with Dushmanziar when they go to war, whenever he goes to war. And in 1037, after a battle, Ibn Sina gets really sick, and they're really close to Hamadan, and he dies. And they bury him in Hamadan, which I'm sure he wouldn't have liked because he desperately wanted to get out of that city. I bet he would have rather have been in Esfahan, but you have to bury quickly, so they buried him in Hamadan. So that's his story in a nutshell. What I want to do now is I want to show you what he did, because I've left out his philosophy and I've left out his major achievements. I just wanted you to see kind of the chaos of the world that he lives in. Let me check the time so I time this a little bit. All right, so his big piece, his opus magnum, of course, is the Canon of Medicine. Here's what happens. When he was a teenager still, he noticed that what most people were calling medicine was just quackery. And by the time he gets to the point where he's writing the Canon of Medicine, canon comes from the Arabic word qanun. Qanun just means law. So it's literally the law of medicine. So right, when you're in the university, they go, you have to read the canon. You have to read the law. You have to read the books that inform you about that subject matter. By the time he writes the Canon of Medicine, he notices something that was driving him nuts, and he spells it out. And that was the concept for disease in the world at the time was that there was disease. It was a singular thing. So, you eat fish and you drank milk and a black cat walked in front of you and Jupiter was in alignment with Mars and now you bleed from the eyes. But if the cat hadn't walked in front of you, it just had a little cough. And that was, and so it didn't matter what your disease was because it was just disease. There was no concept that there were different diseases and there were different ways of getting these diseases and they would affect you in different ways. So Ibn Sina says, okay, this is completely ludicrous. There are diseases, this is plural, they have different transmission vectors, and then they affect you in a different way. And then he says, there are things that could be at stake. It's not whether you drank milk and ate fish, that's not, but your health might matter. And then he says, look, here's 1,000 cures. He says, cures are great, everybody loves them. But you know what's better? Intervention. Stop you from getting sick. Interrupt the transmission vectors. Don't allow yourself to get sick to begin with. If you can do that, that's a lot better than having a cure. And that's the foundation for modern medicine. The goal is prevention. The goal is interrupt the transmission vectors. It's secondarily you go to cures because you have to, but really that's not ideal. That's not the goal. And then the other part of it is there are diseases. And that's why he's the father of modern medicine. From time to time people go, I looked it up and it said it was Hippocrates. That's the father of medicine. He's the father of modern medicine, in case you do this. By the way, I disapprove of Hippocrates being the father of medicine. I think it should be like Pesachet, and then it would be the mother of medicine. She was a physician from about 4,500 years ago in Egypt. She was actually the director of the medical academy. I don't know. That feels like a much better candidate for the person who started medicine than Hippocrates. Hippocrates was 2,000 years later, more than 2,000 years later. Like, it's not even close. But of course, you're going to always make it a Greek if you can, not an Egyptian. Skin's too brown. So, I'm not saying anything you don't already know. By the way, have you noticed that you can't tell Greeks apart from like Persians and Turks either? Their skin's too brown too. I think it's just people are used to looking at the marble statues that aren't painted anymore and they look white. They go, they must have been white. Look, they did marble white statues. But just throwing that out there. Ibn Sina did something else that I think is mind-blowing. So he was a polymath. And he did astronomy, he did mathematics, he did philosophy, he did medicine. Like, he was all over the place. I wish there was a way to like figure this out, but I would bet $10 he had ADHD. Maybe $11. I'm feeling really edgy today. One of the things that happened was from the metaphysics. So The Greeks were really interested in being and what it meant to be. And Ibn Sina dove into this headlong. He fell in love with this. And so he talks about categories of being and all these different ways of thinking about being. I don't want to get into all of that. What I want to get into, though, is this one piece that he came out of with being. That's, I don't know, I find it really interesting. So he said, look, when a thing is, you know what, I kind of have to tell you what Plato and Aristotle said to make it make more sense. So Plato said that the thing that exists, I want something. No, that doesn't work. My boots. Okay, these boots are imperfect. And they are, right? Because there's no way for humans to make anything that's perfect, except for Persians when they make rugs. Those are obviously perfect, which is why they'll intentionally put one stitch in that's incorrect, because only God can make something perfect. So that imperfection that they intentionally put into the carpet, I feel is arrogant. Anyway, it's also really beautiful at the same time, but it also shows the level of skill that's possible. Oh no, I might accidentally make a perfect Persian rug here. So, except for Persian rugs, nothing can be perfect. So my boots, let's take them for an example. So at some point, somebody made them. That's the reality that we experience. But before they made it, it was an idea in somebody's head. Right? According to Plato, that's actually a level of reality that's more real than my boots. And then, where did that idea come from? Plato said there was a plane of existence called the ideos. Translated in English, we usually say the forms. And what he believed was that the mind reaches up into the ideos, grabs the boot, pulls it into the mind, and then that becomes the idea for it, and then uses your hands to make the idea real. So this boot is a copy of the thing that was in my head, which is a copy of the thing that was in the ideos. And so that's the real reality. This is the copy of the reality, and this is the copy of the copy. Aristotle comes along, a student, and goes, what? That's nonsense. What are you talking about? And then he says, look, a thing is a collection of essences. So my boots are brown, although there's different shades of brown. So it's the essence of all those different colors. There's leather, right? There's stitching. So there's the essence of whatever material was used for the stitching. There's a shape to it, right? It's a cowboy boot shape, and there's patterns on it. All of those essences, when combined, make the boot. So this platform that I'm walking on is made up of essences. There's the essence of this curve. There's the plastic material that's in it. If there's wood underneath it for support or aluminum, I can't tell. It's not banging, so it's really well made, because usually when I get on a stage, it's like bang, bang. So I'm really thrilled with this one. Whatever, those are the essences. And then combined, that's what makes the thing the thing. I'm a series of essences. Ibn Sina goes, what is essence? So if I were to try and figure this out, I could actually do it as an information studies event, because that thing can be described as a series of pieces of information. But as time goes by, the information will be added to. Right? For example, the sole on the bottom of my boot is slowly getting worn down. So to describe that wear and tear, I would be adding information. That boot, there's a scratch that I will never fix on it because I was in the battlefield of Yamama and I hit a rock and it scratched my boot. So it's my Yamama battlefield scratch. And so it'll be there forever. So that would be information I would have to describe. And then, right, as time goes by, as my boot gets older and more scratched and more damaged, I'm adding information. You can take you as an individual. When you were born, there wasn't a lot of information, right? It was a lot easier to describe you then than now, because now you have some broken bones and some scars and some mental issues and, right? There's some trauma, some personal trauma. You have a history, you have memories and lost memories too. And I'm starting to get weird spots. I think they're called youth spots. And I've checked. They're not dangerous. It's just I'm getting old, right? And so That's information. And what Ibn Sina realizes then is time and information are correlated. As time goes forward, information is generated, period. And there's no way to undo this. Because think about it, when you die and your body breaks down and decays, talk about how hard it will be to describe you as your atoms are being scattered and digested by worms and whatever else that happens. It becomes even harder to describe you. That information only increases with time, and there's no way to reverse it. That's the principle of entropy. 1,000 years ago, Ibn Sina described entropy. Isn't that cool? Then he said, what if we did this for the whole universe, but ran backwards? What if I took the whole universe and ran backwards in time? Well, there should be less and less information. And then he said, what would happen is, at some point in an unimaginably far past period of time, I would be reduced to a tiny packet of information, but just enough information that the entire universe could unfold from it. He described a singularity. That's Big Bang. 1,000 years ago, 950 years before this contemporary period was working on Big Bang, he did it. I mean, he didn't say it was an explosion. He didn't talk about atoms and helium and being generated from hydrogen and right, none of that, but that's effectively what it is. Isn't that crazy? So his legacy is a really weird one because for the most part, at some level, we kind of lost a little bit of it. In part because of the struggle between the Middle East and Europe and the way that we frame things. But parts of it we didn't. For example, the Canon of Medicine was required reading in Europe. So there was sort of a selective way in which some knowledge was lost on purpose and then some knowledge was retained on purpose. I actually was thinking about this as I was talking, so let me drop this. I'm backing up to the Canon of Medicine. So when I was taught this stuff, I was taught that Ignaz Semmelweis is the guy who said, wash your hands. And he is. I don't want to take any credit away from Semmelweis. What he did saved millions of lives. But I think it's important to understand it in a broader context so that you get the full picture. For the record, the way he figured it out was also kind of interesting. He was a doctor working in a hospital, and he noticed a weird phenomenon. That when women would go in to give birth, the women who saw the expensive doctors, the doctors with lots of experience, had a really high mortality rate. And the women that were too poor for the expensive doctors were surviving just fine. And right, it was completely counterintuitive, and nobody could figure out what was going on. And so one day he decided to just trail the interns, because that's who the poor women were going to. They were going to the guys who were still becoming a doctor. They weren't actually a doctor yet. And, they would go and they'd work on a cadaver, and then afterwards they'd wash their hands, whereas the old doctors who didn't have any training weren't working on cadavers and weren't washing their hands. And that's when Semmelweis went, oh, maybe we should wash our hands. The thing is, that's not the first time that kind of protocol was introduced into a hospital. In ancient Babylon, they had that protocol. There were multiple times in human history where there was some kind of protocol. Hospitals in India 2,000 years ago had a protocol for disinfecting before you would do surgery or before you would treat a patient. And of course, Ibn Sina spells it out in the Canon of Medicine when he says, interrupt the transmission vectors. That's exactly what that is. So in a weird way, one of the things that happened to Europe was because of its biases against non-European culture, there was this mistake made where there were already cultures that had been working on disinfecting protocols. By the way, soap had been around for millennia and were part of the disinfecting protocols. But because of that, it wasn't until, 220 years ago that it got introduced into Europe. And so one of the mistakes of, I think, the sorts of biases that we bring into it is, especially when we don't know history very well, is you have to keep reinventing the wheel. And at some level, I think we should just stop reinventing the wheel and just go with what we already have. And it's something to think about because all civilizations are doomed to collapse. So the chaos and confusion and collapse that Ibn Sina was witnessing, that he was a part of, is something that will happen again. There's no exceptions in history. And it's really arrogant to think this is it, this is the final thing. I think the thing that we have to remember is as we go forward and we build really amazing societies, because there are some really amazing societies on this planet, is we need to be humble and we need to think about the future. And one of the ways that we think about the future is not just we start paying attention to global warming, because that'd be great, but it's also, as our civilization unravels, which it will at some point, it looks like it's starting to already, my alarm bells are going off, maybe we should think about how we transmit that information that we've already acquired into the future instead of making future generations start over again. I mean, this is weird, but they're trying to figure out what kind of symbol they can put on Chernobyl so that in 1,000 years, when there's no Russian and Ukrainian speakers because those civilizations are gone, human beings will know not to go to that spot. Just the fact that we need to start thinking about the future in those ways because we owe it to the future. And so anyway, I think there's a lesson in Ibn Sina beyond just, wasn't he a brilliant scientist, a polymath, and figured all these crazy things out? And it is, how do we frame what we want to see the future looking like as opposed to, I'm just going to live now for me and not care about anything else? Anyway, I think I'm out of time. At least I'm close. Okay. I've got the signal to stop, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roy. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Dr. Roy, please raise your hand. If anyone has any questions, just please raise your hand.
Actually, before you do, I just remembered I brought show and tell.
Okay.
This coin was minted by Dushman Ziyar in 1034 while Ibn Sina was living in Esfahan. So if you want, I'll let you look at it closer. But I just felt like if I brought a little piece of history, it would be weird because there's a distinct possibility that Ibn Sina touched this at one point, right? It's not, who knows? Dushman Ziyar definitely did because he touched every gold coin he minted. He's like, oh, that one, I would have anyway. Anyway.
So thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for the session. Please note that throughout the whole year, we'll be having these sessions with Dr. Roy himself. And the next session, inshallah, will be in April. And you'll find all the details on our website. Thank you so much.